Shalom, shalom, shalom. This is Rabbi Moshe Otero with the Ways of Israel as we're continuing our series of a refresher course through the book of To Be a Jew by Rabbi Donin. We are now in chapter 5, just reviewing the chapter, and it's going to be dealing with the Sabbath, or Shabbat, an island in time. As you know, the Sabbath is the focus and most important part of the Jewish celebration. Every week we get to celebrate a day of rest, a day in which we remember the creation of the world, and more so. For 6 days we are told, you shall labor and do all of your work, but in the seventh day it is a Shabbat, a Sabbath unto the Lord your God. In it you shall not do any manner of work, for the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and sanctified it. Exodus chapter 20, verse 9 through 11. Now this passage is one of the passages found in the Ten Commandments, and it does not itself reveal the absolute profound role that the Sabbath has played in the Jewish life throughout history, and the role it continues to play in the lives of those who lead a Jewish life. But the fact that only this commandment among the Ten Commandments, which deals with the purely ritual observance, ought to indicate the priority assigned to it by the Almighty Himself in the broad context of the commandments that concerns man's relationship with God. Divine priority has in fact been paralleled, as we read in chapter 5, by emphasis given to the Jews themselves. Although the observant Jew subjects himself to many commandments, it harbors there's a special loving connection with that of the Sabbath. You could very easily see it as you see Jewish people walking the streets on Friday night and returning Friday night to have their Shabbat meals at home in the warmth of family. You could also see it Saturday morning as they go to shul to pray to Hashem, to the Almighty, and come back with the idea of being full or filled with Torah knowledge. There's no other commandment or other ritual observance in all of Judaism which you can find such an expression of affection and devotion as for the Sabbath. For it is the only observance which has become personified in religious poetry to such an extent that we will find it in prayers and devotion of the Jewish faith. It is affectionately referred to as the Sabbath bride, or the bride of Shabbat. As a matter of fact, there's a whole song sung regarding the queen of the Sabbath, which is Shabbat. As the bride is traditionally radiant and beautiful, a poetic symbol of the charm and purity as the object of love and affection, so is the Sabbath, the Shabbat for the Jews. It is called the Shabbat Queen, or Shabbat Hamalka. For the queen, too, in the imagination of poets and mystic, are symbols and majesties of beauty and grace, and so is the Sabbath to the Jews. These poetic descriptions of the Shabbat has always retained a very unique place in Jewish observance and in Jewish celebration. It gives the flavor of the Sabbath, of the Shabbat, the observing Jew. The person looking from the outside, Jew or Gentile alike, the Sabbath might appear too restrictive. There's too many things you can't do. But an acquaintance, at least a cursory acquaintance with its restrictions, might lead one to assume that it is an austere day for those who observe it, a day lacking of joy and spirit. Yet the experience from within is just the opposite and just the reverse. It's a time for reflection, yes, but it's time for joy and singing and being with family. And even in the secular recreation, it's a special peaceful tranquility that descends the night of Friday. This inner joy and spiritual uplift is accompanied by songs and cheers and many beautiful songs in the liturgy of the prayers. To describe the feeling of Shabbat, one really has to experience it. On Shabbat is like trying to describe a beautiful sunset to a blind man. However rich in words it may seem, the sense of rapture, of uniqueness, of the warmth, of the beauty, of the sacredness and the holiness of that day goes beyond comprehension and description. Looking at from compared to a deaf man coming in upon a scene where people are dancing to music being played in orchestras hidden from sight, not being able to hear the music, the deaf man might well mistake the dancers for a group of people who have gone mad, crazy. These people are crazy. Of course, he doesn't hear the music, and so the movement of the body which the music inspires is unappreciated and leaves him cold and questioning. And so might the Sabbath, with its restrictions, leaves his observer, unless he has had the opportunity to become part of that experience. Only then may what be drawn upon him, that he may be desirable and eagerly awaited. It's not without reason that the Midrashic description of the Sabbath is that of paradise. A unique world to come is as long extended, unending, eternal Sabbath day, Yom Shekulo Shabbat, as it biblically derives the Shabbat day as a day of Oneg Shabbat, a celebration. Isaiah 58 verse 13 has become so commonplace phrase, and it's used and sometimes misused today by everyday Jews. Now another Midrash portrays God as saying, "A precious jewel have I in my possession, which I wish to give to Israel, and Shabbat is its name." No Jew has ever truly observed Shabbat will argue with you of this description. As a matter of fact, what they do, they want you to have a little flavor of heaven, of the heavenly spirit that descends on Shabbat. They'll invite you over for a meal of Shabbat, or they'll invite you over to celebrate Friday night. If any, he will tell you that it is an understatement of description. It's a pity then that so many Jews in the 20th century have forfeited this most precious possession for the sake of secularism or liberalism in their mindset. Some did do so deliberately and conscientiously under the impact of general ideological rebellion against Judaism, in which they turned to become atheist or atheistic, or into secular ideologies for their own salvation, for that of mankind. Others did so unwillingly and regretfully under the impact of economic pressures and aspirations in the non-Jewish environment. In other words, for the sake of the money. They knew and understood that the pressures were too much for them, and they decided to abandon the keeping of the Sabbath. In this non-Jewish environment of the diaspora in which they lived, where Sunday became the national day of rest instead of Saturday or Shabbat. We could talk about that later, why Sunday is not the day of rest. It's not the day of the Lord. It is Shabbat. While a minority of Jews continue to resist the economic temptation, if it meant for forfeiting the Sabbath, most were not spiritually strong and therefore caved in. And while the first generations among these groups who gave up the Shabbat still harbored precious memory of Shabbat, their children and their grandchildren and their second and third generations were raised without any but most superficial knowledge of Shabbat and its spirits. To revert to our metaphor, the generations were permitted to become deaf and blind to the music and poetry of the Sabbath. Nor it was just the Shabbat that affected by this neglect, but rather the knowledge of Judaism slowly but surely began to deteriorate, and then all Jewish life for that matter. For Shabbat is truly a pivotal point for all Judaism. When Shabbat is discarded, attendance at the synagogue becomes reduced to the vanishing point. And when that happens, the best form of Judaism and Jewish education also disappears. It's no secret that the levels of Jewish education reached by most Western Jews today rarely exceeds that of a second or third grade child in Jewish school. And this is what happens when the level of Jewish education reached by most Western Jews today rarely receives some Jewish education and even complete the 5 or 6 years of Sunday school or afternoon Hebrew school. One who has achieved the equivalent of what ought to be objectively regarded as the 8th grade level is already reckoned as a scholar in the community. Think about that. How low our level of Jewish education has become, and in particular, a person wanting to become part of this family, part of this community, need to understand that the Sabbath becomes the pivotal stance where Judaism begins as well as it's achieved. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam shehakol nehiyah bidvaro. So when the Shabbat is neglected, the Torah and the prophets are no longer reviewed on a regular weekly basis. Eventually, its contents are forgotten. The sermon of the rabbis, however excellent, however powerful, does very little to provide some additional awareness as some extra bits of knowledge of rabbinic and Talmudic sources. The Talmud expresses the view that Shabbat was given to Israel in order that they may study Torah. In other words, that they would have the time to be able to study Torah. One of the aspects of keeping the Shabbat is to study Torah. Furthermore, without Shabbat and the regular attendance at the synagogue, which it generates, the motivation for religious and Hebrew study of children is reduced to a minimum, and reducing the effectiveness of whatever education is received. Within a generation or two, the discarding of the Shabbat causes a knowledge of Judaism to deteriorate, which leads to discarding of still other religious observance, and eventually to the dissipation, even to the moral values of Judaism. Here we have this idea where Jews become assimilated to the culture they live in. Most people think the Shabbat is just a day of rest, when work is prohibited. Quite contrary. This is only partially true, and it was extended to be holy day, a Yom Kadosh, different and set apart aside from all other days. It's not just a day of leisure. It's a high point of the week around which all the other days revolve. As a matter of fact, we count everything and then everything with Shabbat. If on the other hand, it is a day in which we withdraw totally and completely from the demands of the world about us. On the other hand, it's a day also to be imbued with spiritual significance and meaning. It's a day filled not with vain pursuit, but with edifying ones. If it is a day, it is intended to refresh the body as well as to refresh the soul. Resting on Shabbat has a totally different meaning to the Shabbat observer than that which is conveyed in the words of relaxing. The Torah gives two motifs for the Shabbat, which we will examine. The first is a memorial to the creation of the world. Remember this. Two different motifs for Shabbat. A memorial for the creation of the world. And we can also see it's also a memorial to the Exodus of Egypt. As a memorial to the creation of the world, we read in Exodus chapter 20, verse 11. In 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth and sea and all that is in them, and rested on the seventh day. And therefore God blessed the Sabbath day and hallowed it. Then we read, it is a sign for all times, it's forever, between me and the people of Israel. So this sign is between God and the children of Israel. For in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth, and on the seventh day he rested from work and rested. Exodus chapter 31, verse 17. And the second motif that we're talking about is that of a memorial. Remember that you were slaves in the land of Egypt, and that the Lord your God brought you out from there from a mighty and outstretched arm. Deuteronomy chapter 5, verse 15. Sabbath as a memorial to the creation of the world. What lessons are derived from a memorial? What does it testify? Besides, what does the Torah mean to teach us when it says that God rested? Did he actually needed rest? Like a human being that basically needs so exhausted for 6 days of work that he has to take a day off? Is he human that he tires and needs physical rest? It is to teach us that just as God stopped creating physical things on the seventh day, so is man to stop creating on this day. Man is to stop making things, to stop manipulating nature. He is to let all things run by themselves. By desisting from all such labor, we not only acknowledge the existence of the Creator, but also emulate the divine example. By desisting from all work on the seventh day, we testify that the world is not ours, and but it belongs to God. It is the Lord and the Creator of the universe. The fish and the animals that we don't catch, and the plants of flowers that we don't cut or pluck or sow, the grass that we don't water on this day, the goods that we refrain from fashioning or cutting, all this inaction on the part of the individual is another demonstration of homage to the Lord our God, of the returning of all things, as it were, to His domain. On the other hand, any constructive interference of man with the physical world constitute work. Biblical definition of work is this alone: this is why the acts which may not require a lot of physical effort, such as plucking a flower or striking a match, are still called work. To desist from this work on the seventh day is equivalent to recognizing God as the Creator of the world. Now let me just point out to those who follow the universal faith called the Noahide faith, this is one aspect in which you are also required to recognize. And you do this by recognizing, as we'll talk about later, and turning on one candlelight on Friday night. You recognize that it is the Lord's day. Although you may not rest and observe it as the rest of all of Israel, you are required as a child of Noah to do so. And above all, this shows also man's domination over the earth belongs really to God. In fact, that above all, He fashions all things in His environment for His own purpose. The earth and His habitation, the source of the sustenance, plant and animal for food and clothing, and thus He can transform everything into an instrument of human service. He is allowed to rule over the world for 6 days with God's will. On the seventh day, He must, God forbid, forbidden to do so by the divine behest, to fashion anything for His purpose. In this way, He acknowledged that He has no right over ownership or authority over the world. Nothing may be dealt with as a man please, but for everything it belongs to God, the Creator, who has set man into the world to rule it according to His word and His will. On each Shabbat day, the world, so to speak, is restored to God, and thus man proclaims, both to himself and to his surrounding, that he enjoys only a borrowed authority. And therefore, the smallest work done on Shabbat is in fact a denial, a rejection that God is the Creator and that He is the master of the world. It is an arrogant setting up a man as his own master, as his own divinity, God, that he denies the whole task of a Jew as man and as Israelite, which is nothing but a management of the earth according to the will of God. On the other hand, every person that refrains from working on or does work on the Shabbat, it is a positive expression of the fact that God is the Creator. He is the Master. It is He who has set man in his place, and that He is the lawgiver of his life, and that He is the proclamation, and that He is the proclamation in acknowledgement of our task as men and Israelites. So doing work on Shabbat is an ot. The letter ot is an expressive symbol for all times. It's a sign. It's a sign between you and God. Shabbat expresses the truth that only God is the Creator and Master of all man, and together with all else, He is called to the service of that only one God. It is a moed, a time institution, a day singled out from all other days, a summons of the ennoblement of life. It is holy, it is Kodesh. It's a holy time. If during the 6 working days man forgets the Almighty God, in the source of all power and lawgiver, then the Shabbat comes to elevate him, directing him only again towards his Creator. It is a covenant, a brit. The only contact and basis of every relationship between God and the Jew, as we will see, as man and Israelite, is if you consider the world and yourself as God's property or not. And this, of course, we have big problems in this world where man has lifted himself up and above the authority and the rights of God, making himself God over all. That's what we call a true dictator. In regard to your power over the earth, as he lent it to you by God in fulfillment of your task in life, then your life will be lived in accordance with the Torah, the teachings of God. But if you regard the world as your own and yourself as its master, then your contract is torn up, and you just make yourself sport of the Torah. Finally, it is a bracha, a blessing. If you thus renew your covenant with God every Shabbat and you dedicate yourself to be God's servants, and then every Shabbat day He will give you a renewed enlightenment of spirit, enthusiasm, strength, and fulfillment of this holy task, this great task. In this way you will realize how God really calls you to be elevated state of life, and that which is especially experienced in Shabbat. Our sages describe this elevated state as the soul by saying that Shabbat provides the Jew and those who keep it an extra soul, a super soul, a super boom, like my good friend Lee would say, a supercharge of enlightenment, of light, of blessings. So the malacha, the work which is forbidden on Shabbat, is conceived as an execution of intelligent purpose by the practical skill of man. Or more so, it's a production of creation, transforming an object for human purpose, but not physical exertion. Even if you tired yourself the whole day, as long as you have produced nothing within its meaning of the term malacha, you're fine, you haven't broken Shabbat. And as long as your activity has not been a constructive exercise of your intelligence, you have performed no malacha or no work. On the other hand, if you engendered without the slightest exertion even the Shabbat, and you flouted God and undermined your calling as a Jew, your physical powers belong to an animal nature. And it is your technical skills which serves your spirit, that you master the world, and it is with this that human beings, you should subject yourself to God on the Shabbat. Now, in the next, we're going to take a look at that Shabbat is in fact a memorial for the exodus of Egypt. The second motif that we look at, not only do we remember that it is a day that God rested, and thus you should too, but it's also a day in which we remember the coming out of Egypt. This motif beckons us to remember our slavery. We were slaves in Egypt, and cherish our freedom. We became free by God's hand and power. If the Sabbath, on the one hand, emphasizes our servitude to God, it also stresses our freedom from that servitude to human masters. It expresses the freedom of human soul, the freedom of mind, of body, and of everything else. This is why a person who hasn't experienced Shabbat have no idea of the freedom, the true freedom that Shabbat brings him or her. In this context, it's important to note, Torah forbids the work to be carried on even by thy manservant. By the way, the word there, manservant, does not refer to a Jew necessarily. It refers to non-Jews working on the Sabbath. It is a prohibition by the Torah to have your servant, your employees, work on the Sabbath. Wait a minute, Rabbi, you say to me. But I know a lot of Jews who have business that they have their employees work on the Saturday. We're going to get to that answer before we leave this chapter. Because first of all, that's not the proper way to do things. Number one, and a Jew who basically employs a non-Jew on Shabbat must know and understand that it must be from the non-Jewish own volition and desire to do so, but we will not pay for you for working on the Sabbath, for work that you personally have decided to accept upon yourself, but rather we will do it either before Shabbat or after Shabbat. We will pay you, but not on and for the Shabbat. Say, what? We'll get into that a little bit later. By thy manservant, nor thy maidservants, nor thy cattle, in other words, even that which basically sustains you, nor thy stranger that is within thy gates, stranger referring to converts. So don't try to use this trick to say, well, the converts, they have it easy and they could. No, they can't. Because the powers of the convert is that the same as a Jew. To be free of servitude on this day was not only for landowners, the masters, but also the free man. But even in those ancient primitive time was also intended for the strangers. We're talking about it was intended for the convert. It was intended for the servant. It was intended for those toiling beasts, for those animals that would work normally on the fields. And this, for the Jewish sake, they must rest as well. Shabbat is a weekly reoccurring divine protest against slavery and oppression. Lifting up the Kiddush cup on Friday night, so when you lift it up on Friday night, the Jews link the creation of the world with man's freedom, and so declaring slavery and oppression deadly sins against every person and very foundation of the universe. Can one be surprised that tyrants of all times did not permit Israel to celebrate the Sabbath? They forced Jews to work. It's a 7-day-a-week work week. This is one of the biggest challenges that Jew has working in the secular world. That they tell you, you have to work on Saturday. You have to work Friday night. You have to. If not, we don't want you. And thus creating a major challenge to every single Jew who truly loves Shabbat and truly wishes to carry this on. I can tell you stories in Cuba that basically it requires the person to work on Saturday. Many have refused to do so, even at the cost of their own life and their own existence. But slavery does not only consist of doing forced labor, for which one doesn't get paid or gets paid very little. Slavery is not only a situation in which cruel taskmasters stands over you and tell you you can't stop, you must finish the assigned task before you go home or you go for rest. Have you ever stopped to think that you yourself can be your own cruelest taskmaster? That you are capable of driving yourself in a manner that no slave taskmaster ever drove his slaves, and yet you've got to get the job finished. You can be the worst master. And this is why we put ourselves at halt when Friday arrives, because we need to understand that we need to separate this day for the Lord, for holiness. And so our tendency is to finish the job, to get that one piece of work done before sun sets. Even contemporary man doesn't actually go to his job. What does he do? He plays just as hard. He has fun. He goes plays golf. He goes play baseball. He goes and does some other activity on that day which he has a little bit more leisure time, instead of learning to sanctify God and pray to God and ask God for blessing upon his family, upon his community, upon this nation that we need is so bad. In our Western culture, the day of rest has now become a day of busy work. Let's go see a movie. Why can't we go see a movie on Saturday? And so we look for all kinds of way to turn around and find a way out of our obligation to our God who has given us so much. And this is what it refers to, having rest in our souls and in our mind and in our body. What Rashi calls menuchat arei. Does not bring joy to the soul, but also to the body. The second type of rest comes to the wake of completing some project after reaching some goal. And this type of rest comes at the completion of one's work, that one can sigh of relief that we have completed our task for the week. And now we need to take a moment to dedicate to God, to have tranquility, a sense of peace. Menuchat margoa is what Rashi calls it. For in 6 days shall you labor and do all your work, we're told in the Torah. Imagine yourself, the Sabbath arrives after 6 days of work, that all your works have been completed in time, and Shabbat observer feels just this way. Finally it arrives. And the meaning of freedom from servitude has arrived. Ahad Ha'am was quoted as having said, it's a true statement, more than Israel has kept the Shabbat, that the Shabbat has kept Israel. It was the Shabbat, the weekly recurring Shabbat, that lifted the people out of the drudgery, out of the toil, out of the exhaustion of the 6 days of work. And it was princely of dignity that the Shabbat was enabled to be the one true power of the impoverished Jew to rise above his inferior status and condition in which he was subjected. It was a weekly leisure of the Shabbat that enabled hard-pressed people to maintain their contact with religious source in its classic literatures. This enabled them to be able to remain close to Torah knowledge, and on his own level. And it was this weekly Sabbath that provided the resuscitation of physical, spiritual, emotional, psychological, and enabled the Jew for his day of rest, of which it was more than just physical rest. Contemporary rest, or contemporary man, needs a day of rest which is more physical, a Yom Menucha, a day of comfort, of spiritual connection, a day of rest, a day of hope is no less vital. To think that the more affluent society has become so bored, drudged, and blinded under the condition of this day. Modern day man celebrates many holidays, but he observes few holidays. Think about it. He possessed many more hours and days of leisure than those of previous generations, yet he lacks the days of serenity and tranquility. There is no peace for a man that works 7 days a week, and all his toil is about how to make money, how to pay bills, how to do this. He has no peace. Modern man is in fact often romantic and idyllic vision of an isolated island in the sea as a place where such a peaceful calm may be found. That romantic dream in our culture is an island to escape to with whom who are dear to us. Yet the acquisition of an island as a personal retreat is beyond the reach for most people. Yet it's so close to every single Jew, every single believer in God who embraces the Torah. And this is why it provides that just peaceful calm the contemporary man aspires to, but never is quite able to reach it. The Shabbat is within our reach. The Shabbat is inside every single Jew. A Jewry that forgets Shabbat, even on his own soil, will eventually dissipate and crumble spiritually. Whether we Jews live in the country of the diaspora or in the very soul of Israel, and I mean soul as S-O-I-L, not S-O-U-L, Shabbat is no less crucial today in maintaining that uniqueness of our culture, of our faith, and of our mission. It is no less crucial today in keeping Jewry everywhere, conscious of itself, of its faith, and in keeping it spiritually strong dynamically. And this is why the threat of so many who envy us, they envy us because we have this gift from Hashem, from God Himself, at Matan Torah, at the gift of the Torah, that He gave these commandments, not to any other people, but the Jewish people who embraced Torah wholeheartedly. In our next video, we are going to take a look at how to prepare properly for the Shabbat celebration that begins Friday night. Today's Friday, so it begins Friday night. It begins tonight, for those of you. And we do so in such a way that we plan, even before Shabbat, what we're buying during the week. We prepare everything for this day called Shabbat. I want to wish you and yours Shabbat Shalom Mevorach, and this is just the first part of that day that we call Shabbat, the holiness, the island, the paradise on earth called Shabbat. Shabbat Shalom.